Dedicated to the survival of American democracy in an increasingly dangerous world, this is Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney, acted as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy under President Ronald Reagan, founder of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., the go-to man for defense and foreign policy issues, joined by the greatest minds in the security policy business, the special forces in the war of ideas, at Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney.
Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. This is Frank Gaffney, your host and guide for what I think of as an intelligence briefing on the war for the free world. One of the scourges in freedom's long-running war with those who wish to take it down has been anti-Semitism. It is, unfortunately, in our time, enjoying a resurgence in not only places like the Middle East, in which it has been evident more often than not, but in Europe, and indeed even in our own country. One of the few people who has spoken authoritatively, and I believe persuasively, about the most important wellspring of anti-Semitism in our time is Dr. Andrew Bostom. He is, well, a Renaissance man, I believe, the author of a number of extraordinarily impressive volumes about, well, the legacy of Jihad, the title of one, the legacy of anti-Semitism, another, Sharia versus freedom, the legacy of Islamic anti-Semitism, and most recently, Iran's final solution for Israel, the legacy of Jihad and Shi'ite Islamic Jew hatred in Iran. There is a leitmotif, if you didn't notice it, folks. He's big on history and legacies, and one of the reasons why we value his appearances here from time to time is he helps bring them to life for us, helps us understand their implications, the historical precedents and impetuses for behavior like anti-Semitism that is important for us to understand if we're to deal with it effectively in our own time. He is the author of countless periodical essays and columns and articles. He is also a research associate professor of family medicine at Brown University. Dr. Bostom, welcome back to Secure Freedom Radio. It's so good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Frank.
Well, I want to start with the legacy, the history, the roots of anti-Semitism as you see them in this era. Andy, whence does it come from, and who are really its prime practitioners?
Well, unfortunately, it's coming from, as it always has, I believe, from Islam's canonical sources, the Quran, the Hadith, the traditions of Muhammad, and the earliest Muslim biographies of Muhammad, the so-called Sira. But in this era, I usually like to start with things in terms of quantification. And the Anti-Defamation League did an incredible series of surveys, much to their own chagrin, I believe, between 2014 and 2017. They established an instrument. I don't mean to sound too epidemiological about this, but they basically surveyed 11 sort of classic anti-Semitic stereotypes and gauged agreement with at least 6 out of the 11 and applied this scale across the world and established if you agreed with 6 out of 11 of these anti-Semitic stereotypes or more, you were considered a case of extreme anti-Semitism. Then they established the prevalence of this in all the populations that they surveyed. And they literally did this worldwide. It was called the ADL Global 100. And the results were quite striking, published over a period of 3 years between 2014 and 2017, that the world's 16 most anti-Semitic countries were all in the Muslim Middle East, where a rather staggering 74% to 93% exhibited this extreme anti-Semitism. And again, that's the ADL definition, extreme anti-Semitism. Globally, by religious affiliation, it was, again, disproportionately a Muslim phenomenon, 49% amongst Muslims, 24% amongst Christians, no religion 21%, Hindus 19%, Buddhists 17%. They moved on to Western Europe, surveyed a number of countries. The overall prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism within the Muslim communities was between 49 to 68%, average of 55%, I believe. versus 12 to 29% amongst non-Muslims. So again, a 2 to 4.5-fold excess. And then they finally reached the United States, Frank. And here, we're a much more philo-Semitic country, but the prevalence of extreme anti-Semitism amongst Muslims already by 2017 was 34% versus only 14% of the general population. So very consistent 2.4-fold excess.
So, Andy, you're saying that this is not any longer confined to any particular region. And I think it's fair to say there are others who practice anti-Semitism. Historically, before there was Islam, there were Christians who were anti-Semites because they believed that Jews killed Christ and for whatever other reason. But what you're describing in our time, in terms of its virulence, in terms of its intensity, in terms of its, proliferation, is that people who embrace what I think of as Sharia, as kind of the distilled essence of Islam, the doctrine that animates Jihad and so much more, have plenty of guidance from their sacred texts, from Sharia itself, for anti-Semitic attitudes and conduct. Is that right?
Absolutely. And what I did to illustrate this recently at this talk that I gave to the ZOA.
That would be the Zionist Organization of America. And I'm glad you mentioned it because I want people to know how they can see the full talk, which I believe is of surpassing importance, and commend both your host and a keeper of the flame, as a matter of fact, at the Center for Security Policy, Morton Klein, the president of ZOA, and you, of course, Andy, for delivering that speech. But how can people check it out?
The full set of slides with the presentation that I gave are available on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, and the ZOA put it out in a release.
Okay, and your YouTube channel is Andy Bostom.
Yeah, it's two YouTube channels. One is Andrew Bostom and one is Andrew G. Bostom.
Check it out, Andrew Bostom. Give us, again, the essence of your remarks there, if you could, briefly.
So when you look at the last two Grand Imams, the current Grand Imam Al-Tlaib, his immediate predecessor Muhammad Tantawi, particularly the latter, who was a giant amongst modern Quranic scholars, he produced not only a full Quranic commentary, but a 700-page treatise devoted to the Jews, which translates as Jews in the Quran and traditions. And he says the Quran describes the Jews with their own particular degenerate characteristics, killing the prophets of Allah. He gives the Quranic citations, corrupting his words by putting them in the wrong places, other ugly characteristics. And he goes on to say, only a minority of Jews keep their words. The good ones become Muslims. That's Quran 3:113. And he also goes on to sanction violence, and this was particularly disturbing. He says one may go so far as to ban their religion, their persons, their wealth, and their villages. And this is to, quote, rid them of their evil.
Andy, we're going to have to drill down on this on the other side of a short break. I want to make sure we fix where this Grand Imam operates from, what authority he has, and why we ignore what he says and what is in Sharia with respect to anti-Semitism at our own peril, not with regard to you being Jewish or otherwise. It speaks enormously to the danger that the Sharia supremacists represent to all of us. We'll be right back with much more right after this.
Visit us at facebook.com/securefreedom with Frank Gaffney. You're listening to Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C.
Welcome back. We have the pleasure of a second segment with Dr. Andrew Bostom to discuss the wellspring in Islam's Sharia doctrine of anti-Semitism and what it means both for Jews and for non-Jews, that this is a practice that is very much enshrined in that doctrine. Not to say that all Muslims practice Islam according to Sharia or want to live under it or would embrace its teachings, but an awful lot of them do. And he describes some of the data that specifically translates into the adherence to this anti-Semitism program. But Andy, you mentioned not one but two grand imams, and I wanted you to explain why they have that distinction, where they work from, and what the implications of their status in Islam is for the sorts of teachings, the anti-Semitic promoting teachings you've described.
Well, so Grand Imam Tantawi, who passed in 2010, was the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, which is really the Vatican of Sunni Islam, and has been for about 1,000 years now. And so he gives the highest, certainly Sunni authoritative imprimatur to these ideas, and moreover, just as a scholar, he's perhaps modern Sunni Islam's greatest Quranic commentator. He set up a website that has translated now over 100, or has put on in the original Arabic over 100 classical tafsirs which span 1,000 years. So he's really an authoritative figure.
And tafsirs being?
Quranic commentaries, I'm sorry. And he's also a public figure who weighed in to interfaith dialogue, was very, very negative in terms of interfaith dialogue with Israel's chief rabbi. He talked about putting a stick in his eye and reminding him that he believed in everything published in his dissertation. That was a quote I gave you before from his dissertation. But even after the Netanya homicide bombing, a gruesome event on March 27, 2002, he came out proclaiming the legitimacy of homicide bombing of Jews. He condemned Jews as apes and pigs, per Quran 560, and so he stayed pretty hardened in his attitudes. His successor is just as bad. Ahmed Al-Tlaib gave an interview, and remember, he was the number 1 ranked Muslim figure for 2017 in this thing that comes out every year, the Muslim 500. But he gave a very quick very quick commentary on Quran 582. It's a central verse which declares the Jews as the strongest among men in enmity to the Muslims. And he said it's an historical perspective which has not changed to this day. See how we suffer from global Zionism and Judaism. Since the inception of Islam 1,400 years ago, we have been suffering from Jews and Zionist interference in Muslim affairs. And that was his connection with the Quran 582. But the problem is, Frank, that not a single religious figure, not a single political figure condemned these remarks. I was fortunate enough to be in contact with Geert Wilders at the time, whom we both know.
A Dutch parliamentarian.
Yes, and asked Pope Francis to condemn these remarks as well, but of course he didn't. Since that point, Tlaib has blamed the Jews and global Zionism for jihad terror in the Middle East, including the rise of ISIS. He's claimed that the Jews want to march on the Meccan Kaaba, the holy site in Mecca, that the Hajj pilgrims circle. They want to attack the Islam's the Prophet's mosque in Medina. And then he goes on to say that the issue of anti-Semitism is a lie that continues to deceive nations to this day. So, I mean, this is the living papal equivalent.
Well, and Andrew, this is, as always, very provocative stuff, what you're saying. And one of the reasons why I value your participation in this program is I know you've done your homework, the research. You're able to document chapter and verse, and I think one of the reasons why this very formidable presentation you made in July to the Zionist Organization of America really is required viewing is that, it's all there. It's not take your word for it. It's not you popping off with some theory. It is carefully and clinically, if I could use that expression, researched and documented. So this brings us to the challenge that we face in this time, and that is that essentially no one but you and Mort Klein and a few others of us are calling attention to this causal connection between Islam's teachings in Sharia and much of the world's anti-Semitism. And I wanted to ask you, Andy, both to talk about what seems to be happening. You described the silence from Pope Francis, for example, and other political leaders with respect to this Grand Imam, but we have an even more immediate example, more sort of in-our-face example of that in connection with what Representative Ilhan Omar has been doing since she came to the United States Congress to represent the people of Minnesota in terms of her overt expressions of anti-Semitic sentiment, both, that from her own colleagues, including the Democratic leadership of the House of Representatives and members of the press, academics, even, I'm shocked to say, some Jewish organizations in this country. Tell us about that, if you would.
Well, and don't forget Rashida Tlaib, who is at least as virulent. So she has a cohort in this in Congress. I think the Jewish community was identified in a very good interview Yigal Carmon, the director of Memory, gave back in February.
That's the Middle East Media Research Institute. Yes,
that the Jewish community is paralyzed by fears of being labeled Islamophobic. And he exactly brought up this example, and he said there was no protest, no public activity. And he also condemned the American Jewish community for not saying anything in particular about the horrific mosque sermons that Memory monitors and frequently translates or presents them in English if they're presented in English.
Indispensable service.
Yeah, this was going to lead to a state of affairs that was comparable to what's going on in Western Europe, where the Jews are literally under siege if people remain paralyzed by their fears. Now, I will say I was struck within the last couple of weeks by a remarkable interview that Representative Mo Brooks gave, the congressman from Alabama, where he just laid it right on the line that the basis for Tlaib and Omar's anti-Semitism, they identified them both was coming from Islam's religious texts, and that it was going to create a very, very untenable situation for Jews in the Democratic Party, and then potentially more widely. I thought this was incredibly courageous for Congressman Brooks to say.
Well, and the reason that it's so courageous is, as you and I can both attest, the costs associated with speaking truthfully about these facts can induce not just this branding as Islamophobic, but the most virulent kinds of ad hominem, personal, reputational attacks and harm. And so, yes, hats off to Congressman Brooks, but also to you, my friend, and I think to all of those who are currently being wrongly depicted as haters and racists and bigots. And I'm sorry to say I'm among those, but the main thing is that we desperately need this sort of truth-telling. You're a medical doctor. You know better than anybody, Andy Bostom, that you can't cure a disease if you can't properly diagnose it, right?
Exactly. And I think that we can calmly, and by the way, Mo Brooks presented his arguments very calmly and rationally. But I think that if we can just get out what these institutional centers of religious education in Islam are actually saying and publishing, I think that's very, very important, because it's, unfortunately, Frank, it's the Shia as well. And I gave an example of that in my recent ZOA talk, that it's no different. And we're not talking about marginal figures. We're not talking about radicals. We're not talking about jihadist organizations or political organizations within these countries, within Iran, within Egypt, for example. We are literally talking about their Vatican equivalents. And that is a phenomenon that is clearly unique to Islam, and I think is logically connected to those ZOA data that we discussed at the beginning. I mean, I don't see what other encompassing rational explanation there is for such a broad and disproportionate phenomenon.
Well, again, this is a clinical diagnosis by a trained medical professional. You're not just a medical professional, obviously. You're a deeply, deeply knowledgeable historian and forensic, analyst of these sorts of issues. Andy, I regret to say we are hard out of time. This is a topic to which we will return soon, but thank you for your courage, your clarity, your knowledge, your willingness to teach the rest of us about these forces at work that are such a threat to Jews, yes, obviously, and the state of Israel, but I believe also to the rest of us who love freedom in this war for the free world. God bless you, sir. Come back to us again soon if you would. David Goldman joins us.